You have a retirement plan, but then the government changes the rules and the stock market reacts. How do you make the right adjustments? I'm Erik Brenner. Some answers next on Your Wealth Health. Hello and welcome to Your Wealth Health. I'm Erik Brenner, owner of Hilltop Wealth Solutions. If you're watching us on Facebook, please share us with someone who could use this information. And thanks for watching us on yourwealthhealth.com. With me today, I have Matt Arends. He's a private wealth advisor and director of our wealth management at Hilltop Wealth Solutions. And Matt is sitting across the studio from me. We're about 8 feet apart. We're continuing to practice social distancing. So planning for a longer life. That's what we talked about last week, and we're going to talk about it as well this week. People are living much longer than they have been in the past, and therefore retirement years become much longer. So you really have to think about longevity along with some other risks that come into play when it comes to your retirement planning. So today we're going to focus on market risk and policy risk. So let's take a look at what AARP said as it relates to the average life expectancy. You can see that today someone's expected to live to almost 80 years of age compared to 70 just 50 years ago. And so just within that period of time, it's increased by 10 years. And, you know, we often encourage clients to use the excuse saying, well, I'm not going to live that long. Really, you need to think about that. If you have pretty good family history, people are taking better care of themselves, you certainly could live well into your 80s and into your 90s. As well as technology has helped us help you determine how long you'll live. We don't know exactly. But Matt, you know, we do have a tool now that we utilize with clients that's a pretty neat tool that really uncovers some of that longevity possibility.
You're right, Erik. You know, actuarial tables and data that's been added up over the years really helps us plan a little bit better than we used to in the past. We just, again, more data, more statistics are available. And if you take a look at the graph, one of the tools that we use talks about this, the life expectancy table. You know, if you're currently age 61 and 59, we addressed this last week, but we want to just refresh your minds and memory on this. You know, if you are married, both non-smokers, there's about a 50% probability that one person will live to at least age 93. And there's about a 30% probability that both of you will live to age 87. So that's a long period of time in retirement. Oftentimes for people, it could be as long or if not longer than they worked. So you really have to plan ahead. There's a lot of factors that we're going to address in this show, but that's why there's such an importance when we look at longevity. It's not something that we just joke around about.
Yeah, and of course, you know, along with longevity, we have the fact that there are less pensions today, a lot less pensions than what people had 30 years ago, and health care. People aren't able to take their health care with them.
That's right. You know, health care, a lot of times when people retired in the past, they could take that health care plan. It was paid for. They didn't have to worry about that added expense. Pension plans used to be the solution in retirement. It was the number one solution in addition to Social Security. So oftentimes people had 2 to 4 different types of fixed income streams, and that has adapted over time. And now really the planning and the saving is on the individual investor, the retiree themselves. They have to appropriately plan ahead because pension plans are going away. We're not seeing very many of those these days.
Yeah, so let's take a look at the Center for Retirement Research at Boston College listed the 5 biggest threats to people in retirement. Longevity, which we've talked about, is number 1. Market risk certainly is a factor. Health risk, family risk, and policy risk. You know, longevity has been our focus here. It was last week, it is this week. But today we want to focus on policy risk and market risk. And so let's just take a look at some historical. You know, what I wanted to do is I wanted to look historically at some of the big things that have happened from a policy perspective over the last several years. So if we take a look at the screen, you can see that the factors, we go all the way back to when 401ks were established. I mean, it doesn't feel like it's been that long, Matt, but 401ks were established in 1978.
Right, the Revenue Act of 1978 allowed 401ks to be developed, which basically gives employees the ability to defer income at a pre-tax rate. So they're not taxed on that income that is deferred for their retirement savings, but Conversely, in retirement, when they pull those assets out, they'll pay the appropriate income tax. But it allowed and began the development of people to defer income to use for retirement later in life.
So then we will move on to the Tax Relief Act of 1997, and this one was, had inside of it the Roth IRA was born.
Right, and I think this is probably arguably one of the biggest tax advantages, one of the biggest policy changes that people were able to take advantage of after the development of the 401k. The ability for people to defer income into a retirement plan, or defer savings, into a retirement plan. It's post-tax contributions, but it allows those assets to grow tax deferred, and it allows the investor to withdraw those retirement assets tax-free, 100% tax-free. It's a huge tax advantage that began years ago, and some people took advantage of it and were able to accumulate a lot. But we've also seen just even the development there. When it first started, you were allowed to save about $2,000 a year into the plan, and that's progressed. Today, a saver who's age 50 or older can save up to $7,000. And if you're married, that's $14,000 a year that can be deferred or put away into a retirement plan that comes out tax-free.
Yeah, and I remember a lot of people thinking it's not going to last, and here we are. So it continues on. The Pension Protection Act of 2006, the Affordable Health Care Act, Obamacare. Oftentimes we forget about that. That was a big change.
Big change. And again, that goes back to even your comment earlier about taking health care with you in retirement. As that disappeared or has faded away, people who were retiring at age 60 or 62, they had several years that they now have to appropriately plan for before they can get on Medicare.
Yeah, and then we had the big tax law changes, the Secure Act, and that changed a lot of things as it relates to the tax laws. One of them including reducing the amount of tax brackets and widening those tax brackets. And we've said on this show that many times that we're in lower tax brackets and wider tax brackets than we were 10 years ago.
That's exactly right. And I think it's hard for people sometimes to plan out 20 or 30 years because we just don't know where tax brackets are going to be. We don't know what tax rates are going to be, especially as you start talking about government bailouts and funding stimulus packages. That's going to have to get made back up somehow. Tax revenue helps pay for the fiscal policy of the government. But what we do know is we can appropriately plan with projections of tax brackets today and try to take advantage of the most tax efficient savings tools today and savings vehicles today to prepare yourself for the future.
Yeah, that's great. And then, of course, the Secure Act, which was effective January 1st of 2020. So a lot of changes there as well. So what do you think people worry the most about when it comes to policy changes?
I would say it's probably the uncertainty, right? It's the not knowing. It's much easier when you can plan ahead 20 or 30 years down the road and say, I know exactly what my tax rate's going to look like. I know exactly what my tax bracket will look like, what these tax vehicles will look like, how my health care is influenced and Social Security is going to be appropriately done. And if you don't know those things, it becomes difficult, and the market can react certain ways. And people's behaviors can react certain ways.
So do you think sometimes the changes are never really quite as bad as what people maybe think they're going to be?
I would say you're probably right. Usually it seems like policy favor helps people because they're learning along the way. The government is making tweaks to try to better the economy and try to better the individual saver.
Great. Thanks, Matt. So policy changes, of course, can have an impact on the markets, and they often go hand in hand. When we come back on Your Wealth Health, market risk and strategies to minimize that risk. Also, we're going to have the answer to this question. What is the average annual return of investment for the S&P 500? Is it 6%, 8%, 10%, or 12%? Stay with us.
I switched to Home Comfort Experts.
We switched to Home Comfort Experts.
I switched.
We switched.
I switched to Home Comfort Experts.
To keep my family safe.
For their expertise.
For efficiency.
Because I trust them.
We're comfortable.
I'm comfortable.
We switched to Home Comfort Experts, and I couldn't be happier.
It's time for your annual furnace tune-up. Call now and take advantage of our $89 20-point precision tune-up. 574 255 4600.
Welcome back to Your Wealth Health. I'm Erik Brenner, owner of Hilltop Wealth Solutions, and along with me today is Matt Arenz, our Director of Wealth Management, and we are continuing to practice social distancing. As people live longer during retirement, they'll be exposed to more market risk, and although market has a long history of doing very well for people, take a look at the answer to our trivia question for today. We asked, what is the average rate of return for the S&P 500? And the answer is 10%. If you think about that, we say this often, that investing would be pretty easy if people could take risk because they could invest in the S&P 500. It's got a long track record over time and has earned 10%. But unfortunately, Matt, that's not quite the case. People obviously have different levels of risk. And so oftentimes we hear sequence of returns. And maybe out there in our viewing audience, they've heard sequence of returns, they've read about it. And so what does it really mean?
I think sequence of returns just really means what is the market doing on a cyclical basis. So, one year you could have a 10% return, next year you could have a lose 2%, up 5% the next year. And so oftentimes you hear people say average, right? You just said that the S&P is averaging 10%. But what we realize is it's just not this slow-moving, steady uphill return. There's a lot of volatility that comes into play. And actually, if you take a look at our graphic here, you can see there's a lot of pullbacks in the market. In the last 20 years, the market's had 11 years where it's pulled back at least 10%. But that doesn't necessarily mean that's going to be your return for the year. If you become emotional or irrational with your investing, it can be. If you're seeing the market drop and you freak out, you could pull your assets out. But that's not always the best case scenario. Most of the time, you really need to stay invested because this graphic actually shows exactly that. If you take a look at from 2009 to 2012, we saw in 2009 the market pulled back 27%, but it still finished positive 26% for the year. That's almost a 50% variance. Even 2011, we saw almost a 20% decline, but still positive 2%. And so, you can't allow volatility to control what you're doing in your portfolio. You have to have a good investment strategy, stick with it, because we do know that volatility and a lot of variance in portfolio is inevitable. It's going to happen.
Matt, and I think about, well, first off, in this period of 2000 through 2019, there were 5 years that finished negative. Mm-hmm. So, over a 19-year period. And you mentioned that 2011, if someone made a decision to kind of sell out or whatever, or got nervous when they were 15% down, it was at the low of 18 and it finished at 2. Now you're talking about a 17% swing. And so the sequence of returns also looks at when you're retiring or retired and you start drawing money from there. That certainly can be detrimental to the portfolio, drawing money from a real negative year.
Correct.
Or several negative years.
Correct. Right. If you're pulling assets out while the market's declining significantly, it's difficult to make up those. But we understand that people still have to put food on the table and pay their expenses in retirement.
Yeah. So, we've had now for years low interest rates. So there is a form of market risk is interest rate risk. So why don't we explain to the folks what that is?
Sure. So interest rate risk is really just going to be, what are you getting paid on cash assets? What are you getting paid on conservative assets, CDs, savings accounts? You also have inflationary risks involved in there. So as the cost of goods increase, let's say you're getting a 5% investment return, but inflation goes up 3%, really the value of your dollar is only increased by 2%. And that's the real rate of return that you're experiencing is a 2% growth. So, we always tell people you have to at least outpace inflation, otherwise the value of your dollar is going to decrease on an annual basis.
Yeah, so in interest rate risk, inflation risk. I
Right.
think a lot of people know what that is. I mean, we've had lately some historically lower inflation numbers.
Definitely historically lower. We're starting to see in periods, I think of this year, 2020, you're seeing the cost of lumber, timber, those types of things, building a house, raw materials, those are increasing at a much faster rate than maybe clothing because retail sales are down. So you're going to have different periods where different sectors have higher inflationary numbers, but overall, yes, you're right. We're seeing unusually low interest rates, inflationary rates, and those are coupled with the interest rate risk that you talk about, unusually low. The Treasury rate, the Fed funds rate, at historical lows, almost near zero, with an attempt to boost the economy. But long term, that puts a lot of added pressure on investment portfolios.
So the next risk I think is often asked. Am I taking the right amount of money? Am I taking too much? And that's withdrawal rate risk. And, that really is critical when you're looking at a retirement distribution plan.
Without a doubt. We hear usually, a 4% rule. A 4% withdrawal rate is a rule of thumb. And while I think that has a lot of merit, and we've seen that year over year have a lot of merit, it doesn't necessarily mean it's the only withdrawal rate that somebody can experience. But you're right, taking too much money in sequential periods can put a lot of stress on a portfolio, especially if you're not receiving a high enough rate of return to offset that, and you have high inflationary cost factors. That can put a lot of stress on a portfolio, and people can oftentimes just spend down too much money. But I do think that what we've experienced over the years is what you could start with a 4% withdrawal rate, but again, it depends on when you retire, what type of lifestyle you're leading, your longevity risk. It also, do you have a part-time job? Do you have other sources of passive income? Those are the types of things that really you have to begin to plan appropriately so that you can understand what that withdrawal rate risk looks like for you, as opposed to just a simple rule of thumb.
And often I think people think they'll spend more early on in their retirement, and that may be the case with travel, going to see family, and so forth. And oftentimes we put that as a goal for people that they want to utilize their assets to enjoy their retirement. But they also could spend a lot of money towards the end of their retirement years just based in health care, needing additional care, long-term care facilities, and so forth.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's one of those things that expenses don't seem to go away in retirement. And I think that's what we experience the most is how people spend money just is going to look different throughout their lifestyle, throughout their retirement. Where it might be more on leisure, travel, and fun early on. It could be on healthcare related expenses or family expenses later on in life.
So how if someone thinks about the policy risk and they think about the market risk, how should they put those two, how should they think about them together?
Well, I think when you take a look at market risk, you just have to have a game plan, and you have to determine what am I comfortable when it comes to risk? What am I comfortable when it comes to volatility in my portfolio? If you see your portfolio drop 15%, are you going to be able to sleep at night? Are you able to stomach that risk? Or are you going to make drastic changes in your accounts because you're not comfortable with it? At the same time, when you take a look at policy risk, you have to understand policy risk will influence the market. And so we don't exactly know when those policies are coming out and how the timing of that looks. But again, it comes down to you have to be aware of it. You have to know it exists. You have to understand it. and you have to realize what you're comfortable with, and you have to make sure that you're going to stick to the game plan, because we don't want to just pay attention to short-term volatility, short-term risks. We have to, again, look at the longevity of your lifestyle and adjust appropriately.
You know, and we say all the time, we just don't want to make decisions based on emotion, right? Because we looked at that graphic earlier with the markets and the intra-year downtimes, and if you base it on emotion, you probably won't win a lot.
No, not at all. I think most of the time what you'll end up doing is you'll sell while the market's down, and after the market recovers and rebounds nicely, you'll feel like things are good again, and now I'll jump in. So all you've done is you've sold low and you've bought high, and that's not going to help you with a good investment return.
Great. Thanks, Matt. So with all these risks associated with your retirement, what are the key questions you should ask your financial advisor and yourself, and what you should expect from them? We'll have some answers when we come back on Your Wealth Health.
Hey everybody, this is Ken Steve with K's Cleaning. I'm here today to talk about pets. Dogs, cats, they're starting to shed, they're getting all messy, it leaves in dandruff. Hey, you need some help to get that cleaned up? Go and give us a call over at K's. Besides, you don't want to have to deal with this mess by yourself. That's why you have us. We're here for you. Because at K's Cleaning, when your pet's dirty, we come in a hurry.
Why for so many years we achieved so much, prospered as no other people on earth. It was because here in this land, we unleashed the energy and individual genius of man to a greater extent than has ever been done before. Freedom and the dignity of the individual have been more available and assured here than in any other place on earth.
Welcome back to Your Wealth Health. I'm Erik Brenner along with Matt Arenz, and we want to take a little more time to review some of the key points and retirement risks that we've been discussing here over the last couple shows. And so certainly longevity was one of them. We looked at market risk, health risk, family risk, and policy risk. You know, digging in, Matt, a little bit more to risk and investing, you know, market risk. You know, how does one go about, and we get this question all the time, am I taking enough risk? What are other people doing? You know, am I similar to someone else? And, you know, risk is just, it really gets down to a personal, how you feel about it, you know, what your comfort level is.
You're right. It comes down to a comfort level. It also comes down to if you really can clearly define what your goals are, when you plan to achieve that goal, how much that goal is going to cost. We also find that people can have different types of risks for different goals, right? So if I'm planning for college, or if I'm planning to buy a second home, or I'm planning, whatever that goal is, you might find that you have different risks associated with that specific goal, where I could be more aggressive when a goal is 20 years out, but I'm not going to be as aggressive with my investing when the goal is 2 years away. So again, to your point, it's you got to be able to sleep at night. You have to understand what that goal is, how much it's going to cost, and you can plan appropriately. But what I wouldn't do, Erik, is do what somebody else is doing because it sounds right. Well, that person took on this type of risk and bought this type of investment, and it it made them this much money. That doesn't necessarily solve your risk goal.
So, you know, we break it down a little further to needs. You know, what is your basic need going to be? And of course, it's in today's dollars and then inflated out.
Right.
Healthcare, so that's certainly a big one. So what's healthcare cost going to be? So we want to look at that. And then other wishes, you know, travel, you know, and it's pretty common for us to, especially early on in retirement, to have clients have an actual travel budget. Travel, you know, this is what I'd like to spend a year, because that's set aside, that's not getting in the way of their needs and their health care, and they know they can do it. And then other wishes as well, you know, you know, maybe there's still children that they're helping through school, or grandchildren. You know, it's important, as you said, to kind of define those and put some numbers to them.
You're exactly right. So, you know, we view that as needs, wants, and wishes, right? So what are my basic needs? How do I get those covered? If I don't get the wants and wishes, at least I know that my expenses are paid, my health care is taken care of, and I can put food on the table. The wants are going to be that next level of things I want to do. So I want to travel. I want to buy a new car every other year. I want to put an addition on the house. And then the wishes might be those, well, I got to stretch a little bit for this, but that doesn't mean I'm not going to plan for it, right? It's not just going to happen somehow. I have to plan for it. And then your healthcare. And I think what we've done a good job over the years on is really begin to understand, especially when you talk about inflationary risk, healthcare costs go up at a different rate than retail costs go up. College planning has a different inflationary rate, and you have to begin to define what are those goals, what are they going to cost, and assign the appropriate inflationary rate. And that again is going to then help determine what your market risk is going to be and your investment risk is going to be to achieve those goals.
So when I think about this risk as well, again, the change that's happened over the last 30 years in this retirement kind of planning is, somebody could get to retirement because their potential life expectancy was shorter. They could probably be more conservative.
Correct.
But now with potentially having 30, 35 years, maybe longer in retirement, those kind of get real conservative. And oftentimes I've heard folks say, well, when I get to retirement, I'm going to change my risk model. And that may not be the most beneficial thing to do.
You're right. I think let's say you're saving for 30 years, you're not going to be super conservative in that savings model, right? Or overly conservative, most likely, because you want to have growth. Well, if you're retired for 30 years, you can't back that risk down traditionally to a point where you're so conservative that you're not even keeping up with inflation, especially in today's interest rate environment. So you have to plan for that longevity. It doesn't mean when you get to retirement, you all of a sudden just back your risk down so that there's never an opportunity for growth, but it does come with market volatility, and that's okay as long as you're appropriately planning for it and staying on top of it.
Yeah, and maybe there's enough there that you can be more conservative. And this we talked about it in the previous segment, is this interest rate environment they're just low now, and unfortunately, those that want to go out and get savings accounts, CDs, those types of vehicles, they're just not getting a lot of interest with them. And we always encourage people to know that if there's higher interest that comes, fixed interest, whether that's through annuities and so forth, just need to be cautious on. There's a give and take there.
There's a give and take. There could be appropriate, fees associated with those. There could be, it's a non-liquid investment. It's tying up your assets. So you have other risks that present themselves that you have to be well aware of. There are high commission products, those types of things that you want to avoid. You just don't want to lock your money up with a bunch of fees and terms that now doesn't make it accessible so that you can use it when needed in retirement.
So, overall, Matt, when we talk about this survey, which kind of sparked us to share this with our audience, is, longevity probably will continue. We think that, with advances in medicine and so forth, longevity is going to continue. I think people will still want to retire.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And planning is going to be even more important.
It's going to be paramount.
Yeah.
And if you don't do it right, you're gonna regret it later on in life. That's for sure.
Yeah. Thanks, Matt. So if you have questions about your retirement plan, your overall financial plan, we're here to help. We offer a free 30-minute phone consultation. We can actually do a free risk assessment with you to help determine if you're on track and whether or not we can help you and assist you. You can visit us at hilltopwealthsolutions.com, or you can give our office a call to schedule that free get-to-know-you consultation. And we'd be glad to help you along the way. Well, we're out of time for today. So for Matt Arenz, I'm Erik Brenner. For the entire Hilltop team and staff, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next week.